Picture this. The year is 1808. You are a French soldier who marched into Spain expecting to be welcomed as a liberator. Instead, every village you enter looks at you with hatred. Your supply lines are constantly ambushed. Your comrades disappear in the night. And somewhere in that progression from liberation to occupation to total war, something broke.
What I am about to show you is a taxonomy. 7 distinct methods French soldiers used against Spanish civilian women during the Peninsular War, ordered not by when they occurred, but by psychological severity.
Each one worse than the last. Each one documented in letters, military reports, and survivor testimonies that historians spent 200 years trying to keep out of mainstream narratives.
You probably know about number 1. Maybe you have heard vague references to number 3. But number 7, the method that made even battle-hardened French officers write letters begging Napoleon to intervene, that one almost never makes it into the history books. This was not random violence. This was a system that evolved, a hierarchy of cruelty that escalated as the occupation dragged on and conventional warfare collapsed into something far more savage.
By the end, you will understand why the Spanish call this period the War of Independence, while the French barely mention it at all.
You will understand why Goya's paintings of the era look like scenes from hell. And you will understand exactly what happens when an army stops fighting soldiers and starts waging war on an entire population.
Ready? Let us start at the baseline and work our way down. Number 1. The public shearing.
This is the one most people have heard about. Usually sanitized as women who collaborated with French soldiers had their heads shaved. That is the comfortable version.
Here is what actually happened. The mechanism was simple but psychologically precise. When French troops occupied a Spanish town, they would identify women who had any interaction with them, selling food, washing clothes, sometimes just being seen speaking to a French soldier. These women would be dragged to the town square. Their hair would be cut off in front of the entire community, while French soldiers held back any family members who tried to intervene. The engineering here was not the act itself. It was the timing and the audience.
This was done in daylight, in the most public space available, with the woman's family, neighbors, and friends forced to watch. The hair was not just cut. It was hacked off with bayonets or cavalry sabers, often leaving cuts on the scalp that would scar.
Here's the psychological payload. In Spanish Catholic culture of 1808, a woman's hair was tied to her marriageability, her honor, her social standing. Removing it publicly didn't just humiliate her, it destroyed her future. She became marked, unmarriageable, a social outcast in her own community.
French Lieutenant Jacques-Francois Martin recorded an incident in his diary in May 1809. The women cried out not from physical suffering, but from deep humiliation. Their mothers wept even more intensely. I realized then that we had caused a harm more profound than if we had simply ended their lives.
This was the baseline, the floor of the taxonomy. And here is what should disturb you. This was considered the merciful option, because everything that comes next was designed to go beyond social death into something that attacked the body and mind directly.
Think about that. This was the mild version, and we are only at number 1. Number 2, the forced march. This is where the cruelty shifts from social humiliation to physical engineering.
And here is what makes this method particularly sinister. It was disguised as military logistics. The mechanism worked like this. When French troops moved between towns, they would take Spanish women from the occupied villages and force them to march with the army. Officially, this was for support services, cooking, washing, carrying supplies. The reality was far more calculated. These women were made to march at the same pace as soldiers, covering 20 to 30 kilometers per day, but without soldiers' boots, without rations, without rest periods.
They carried loads, packs, cooking equipment, sometimes wounded soldiers on makeshift stretchers. When they collapsed, they were beaten until they stood, or left behind.
Here is the engineering detail that reveals the intent.
French military regulations of the era specified that infantry should receive boot replacements every 4 months and daily rations of bread and wine.
The Spanish women marching with them received neither. They walked in whatever shoes they had been wearing when taken, often cloth slippers designed for walking to church, not military marches.
The biological failure point was predictable. Within days, feet would blister. Within a week, infections would set in.
Some women developed such severe foot wounds that their toes would necrotize and had to be amputated by battlefield surgeons, if surgeons were available. British Captain William Warr, observing French movements in 1810, wrote, "The French columns are followed by Spanish women in such a state of exhaustion and injury that I cannot comprehend how they remain upright. Several collapsed during the hour I observed. The French did not stop for them."
But here is what makes this worse than simple neglect. The duration was the weapon. These forced marches could last weeks or months as armies moved across Spain. Women who survived the physical ordeal often found themselves deposited in towns hundreds of kilometers from their homes with no means to return, their feet too damaged to make the journey back.
This was not just cruelty. It was displacement as warfare. You remove women from their families and communities. You destroy those communities' ability to function. It was demographic warfare hidden inside military logistics.
And we are still in the lower third of the hierarchy. Everything so far involved suffering that ended. Either the humiliation concluded, or the march finished, or you died. What comes next introduces something darker. Methods where the suffering continued long after the French moved on.
Number 3. The contamination protocol. This is where we shift from what was done to bodies to what was done to survival itself. And this is the point where the French military leadership started to lose control of what their soldiers were doing in occupied territory.
The mechanism was devastatingly simple. When French troops abandoned a town, either retreating or moving to new positions, they would systematically poison the town's water supply before leaving.
The engineering varied by location. In towns with wells, soldiers would dump animal carcasses, horses, dogs, sometimes human corpses, down the well shafts. In towns that drew water from rivers or streams, they would slaughter livestock upstream and leave the bodies to rot in the water.
In some documented cases, they added chemical contaminants, lime, sulfur compounds, anything that would make the water undrinkable.
Here's the biological timeline. Within 24 hours, the water would become unsafe. Within 3 days, anyone drinking it would develop severe dysentery. Within a week, cholera could take hold in the population.
Children and elderly died first, then pregnant women, then anyone already weakened by the occupation's food shortages.
Spanish physician Don Manuel Hurtado de Mendoza documented the aftermath of one such incident in Talavera in August 1809. When we returned to the town 3 weeks after the French withdrawal, we found 89 dead, not from violence, from the water. The French had thrown so many carcasses into the wells that we had to seal them permanently. The town had to be abandoned.
But here is what makes this especially calculated. The French knew Spanish towns could not quickly dig new wells or establish new water sources. They knew the civilian population had no choice but to either drink contaminated water or flee, leaving the town empty. This was not collateral damage. This was deliberate rendering of territory uninhabitable. And here is the gendered dimension. In Spanish rural culture, women were responsible for water collection. They were the ones who discovered the contamination. They were the ones who had to choose between watching their children die of thirst or watching them die of cholera. The psychological burden of that choice was the actual weapon.
In a letter dated September 1810, French Sergeant Claude Etienne Michel reflected on the aftermath left in that town. He mentioned the wells and chose not to detail what was discovered within them. He expressed a deep conflict between the actions taken and the values he had believed his side upheld, especially considering he had children of his own in Paris.
Notice the pattern emerging. Each method introduces a new dimension of horror. Number 1 attacked social identity. Number 2 attacked physical capability. Number 3 attacked survival infrastructure itself.
and each one had lasting effects that persisted long after the French soldiers were gone. But we are about to cross a threshold. Everything so far, as horrifying as it was, still falls within the boundaries of what the brain can process as war is terrible. What comes next crosses into territory where the brain starts to reject the information because it conflicts with the assumption that there are limits even in war.
Number 4, the church protocol. This is where the cruelty becomes theatrical, where the engineering is not just about causing suffering, but about causing it in a location specifically designed to maximize psychological trauma.
And this is the point where Spanish resistance transformed from political opposition into total war. The mechanism required 3 elements: a church, a congregation, and timing. French soldiers would wait until Sunday Mass, when churches were filled with civilians, predominantly women, children, and elderly people, as most young men were either dead, in hiding, or fighting with guerrilla bands. Mid-service, French troops would enter and seal the exits. What happened next varied, but followed a recognizable pattern. In some cases, soldiers would force women to strip inside the church and kneel naked before the altar while soldiers watched. In other cases, they would select specific women, often the priest's sisters or known matriarchs of the community, and violate them on the altar itself, while the congregation was forced to watch.
Here is the engineering of desecration. In Spanish Catholic culture, the church was not just a building. It was literally the house of God, consecrated ground where the divine presence dwelt.
To violate a woman inside a church, specifically on the altar, the holiest point in the space, was not just assault, it was theological destruction.
The psychological mechanism worked through forced witnessing. When you force a community to watch a violation in a space that represents their spiritual protection, you are not just destroying the victim.
You are destroying the community's belief that any space is safe, that any authority, earthly or divine, can protect them. Spanish priest Don José García Conde documented one incident in Salamanca in December 1809. They took the sexton's daughter and forced her to the altar. They made her mother watch. They made me watch. When it was done, they asked me where my God was. I had no answer. The church was abandoned after that day. No one in the village would enter it again. Here is what the French command did not anticipate. The church protocol did not break Spanish resistance. It radicalized it. Communities that had been cautiously neutral began hiding guerrilla fighters. Women who had avoided involvement began carrying messages, hiding weapons, and sometimes joining combat units themselves. The Spanish called these women las guerrilleras, and they became among the most ruthless fighters of the entire war. Because once the church was violated, there were no more sacred boundaries left to preserve. The war became existential. And we are still not at the apex. Everything so far, as extreme as it was, still ended. The humiliation concluded. The march finished. The water supply could eventually be restored. Even the church violation had a definite beginning and end. What comes next introduces duration as the weapon, suffering that does not conclude. Number 5, the pregnancy protocol. This is the worse-than-death pivot, the point where the cruelty shifts from bounded horror to unbounded horror. And this is the method that even hardened French officers began writing letters to Paris begging for intervention. The mechanism was grotesquely simple. When French soldiers identified pregnant Spanish women in occupied territories, they would systematically beat the abdomen. Not randomly, with calculated force designed to induce miscarriage without killing the woman. The engineering required surprising precision. Too much force and the woman dies quickly. That ends the suffering. The goal was to apply enough blunt trauma to the abdomen to damage the fetus, while keeping the woman alive through the miscarriage process and whatever infections followed. Survivors' testimonies describe soldiers using rifle butts, fists, and in some documented cases, systematically jumping on the woman's abdomen. The biological process that followed was nightmarish. Miscarriage induced by trauma is rarely quick. It could take hours or days.
The woman would remain conscious through the cramping, the hemorrhaging, and the eventual expulsion of the fetus.
But here is the dimension that makes this unbounded rather than bounded horror. If the woman survived, and many did, she was left with the knowledge of what had been taken from her and the high probability of permanent reproductive damage.
Multiple survivor accounts describe women who endured this and were never able to carry another pregnancy to term. Spanish midwife Doña María Josefa Martínez testified to a Spanish military tribunal in 1812 about one case in Badajoz. I was called to help her after the French left. The bleeding would not stop. She survived the miscarriage, but not the fever that followed.
Before she died, she told me she was grateful. She said living with what they had done would have been worse.
Think about that. The victim expressed gratitude for death. That is the marker of unbounded horror, when survival becomes the punishment rather than the escape.
Here is the strategic calculation behind this method. Pregnancy represented future generations. By targeting pregnant women, French soldiers were waging war not just on the current population, but on the demographic future of Spanish communities.
It was genocide in embryo, literally. And here is what makes it especially horrifying. This was not the act of a few rogue soldiers.
British intelligence officer Colonel Charles Erskine, embedded with Spanish forces in 1811, wrote, "The frequency of this particular atrocity across vast distances suggests it is not random, but emerges from some shared understanding among French troops of what is permitted. That should disturb us more than if it were the acts of a few madmen."
Systematic, widespread, calculated. That is what makes it unbounded. It was not chaos. It was policy that emerged from the bottom up when the top lost control. But we are not done. We are at number 5. There are 2 more methods, and each one represents another escalation, another threshold crossed.
Number 6, the starvation enclosure. This method represents the next dimension of horror, temporal extension. Where the previous methods occurred in moments or hours, this one occurred across weeks or months. And the engineering here was not in the violence itself, but in the careful maintenance of a system designed to prolong dying as long as possible.
The mechanism required a space and a population. When French forces occupied larger towns or cities, they would identify buildings, usually convents or monasteries, and designate them as enclosures for civilian containment. Spanish women were rounded up and forced inside. Then the doors were sealed and guarded. But here is the critical detail. They were not killed. They were maintained in a state just above starvation. Guards would deliver minimal rations, enough to keep the women alive, not enough to restore their strength.
French military records seized after the war show calculated ration schedules, approximately 400 calories per day, just above the threshold where mass death would occur within weeks. The biological failure cascade was precise.
Within the first week, the body depletes glycogen stores and begins consuming muscle tissue. By week 2, cognitive function begins deteriorating. By week 3, the immune system starts failing and infections take hold.
By week 4, women began developing edema, their bodies swelling from protein deficiency, even as they starved. But here is the engineering that reveals the intent. The guards were specifically instructed to prevent suicide.
When women tried to hang themselves or slash their wrists with any sharp object they could find, guards would intervene, provide minimal medical care, and return them to the enclosure. Death was not permitted. Suffering was mandatory. Spanish survivor Doña Isabel Ruiz de León, who spent 4 months in an enclosure in Ciudad Rodrigo in 1810, testified, "The worst part wasn't the hunger.
It was knowing they were keeping us alive deliberately. We begged to be shot. They laughed. They told us they needed us alive so we could tell the guerrillas what happens to the families of rebels."
This was hostage-taking elevated to industrial scale. The women were not being punished for their own actions. They were being used as leverage against male resistance fighters. Their suffering was a message delivered in real time, because the French knew that guerrilla networks would learn what was happening inside the enclosures. And here is the duration component.
Some women spent 6 months or more in these conditions, long enough for their hair to fall out from malnutrition, long enough for their teeth to loosen from scurvy, long enough for permanent organ damage that survivors carried for the rest of their lives.
British Colonel Alexander Gordon, who helped liberate one enclosure in Salamanca in 1812, wrote, "I have seen battlefields. I have seen the aftermath of sieges. Nothing prepared me for what I found in that building."
The women who survived were so physically destroyed they could barely walk, but the physical damage was not the worst of it. Several had gone completely mad.
And that is the key to understanding why this is worse than number 5. The pregnancy protocol destroyed a specific future. The starvation enclosure destroyed the self.
Women who survived were so fundamentally altered, physically, psychologically, neurologically, that they could not return to who they had been. They became living testaments to what total war does to human beings.
But there is one more. Number 7, the apex of the hierarchy. And this is the method that military historians actively avoid discussing in detail.
The one that Francisco Goya witnessed firsthand and tried to capture in his Disasters of War series, but found that even visual art could not adequately convey. Number 7, the witness chain. This is the most psychologically sophisticated method on the list. It is also the most rare, precisely because it requires planning, time, and a level of calculation that suggests it emerged from someone who understood psychological torture at a theoretical level.
The mechanism required 3 generations: grandmother, mother, and daughter. French soldiers would identify families with this generational structure, not difficult in Spanish villages where extended families lived nearby.
All 3 would be taken to a public location. Then the procedure would unfold in a precise sequence.
First, the granddaughter would be violated while the mother and grandmother were forced to watch. Then, the mother would be violated while the grandmother and traumatized daughter watched.
Finally, and this is the detail that reveals the calculated cruelty, the grandmother would be violated while the mother and daughter watched.
But here is the mechanism that elevates this beyond just sequential assault. Between each act, there was a rest period. The soldiers would stop, sometimes for hours, sometimes overnight. They would feed the family, provide water, treat any physical injuries, then continue.
The engineering here is not in the physical violation itself. It is in the forced waiting, the anticipation. Each woman knows what is coming next and is unable to prevent it. Each woman watching what happened to her mother and daughter, and knowing that is what she looked like. Each woman surviving to carry the memory of what she witnessed.
This is trauma engineering at its most precise. Single traumas can potentially be psychologically contained, but when you create a chain where each woman experiences both personal violation and witness trauma of loved ones, you create compound trauma that the brain cannot effectively process or file away.
Spanish physician Dr. Antonio Rivas, who treated survivors of one documented case near Burgos in 1811, wrote, "The physical injuries healed within weeks, but the 3 women could not speak to each other afterward. When placed in the same room, they would face away from each other, unable to meet each other's eyes."
The grandmother died 6 months later. The medical cause was listed as failure of the heart, but I believe she died because she could not bear to continue living in a world where she had witnessed what she witnessed.
Here is what makes this the apex. Every previous method, as horrible as it was, had the mercy of limited witness. Your individual suffering was your own, but the witness chain destroyed the boundaries between self and other. When you watch your daughter or mother endure what you endured, your trauma doubles. You carry both your own suffering and the memory of theirs. And here is the final mechanism that makes this unbounded.
In Spanish Catholic culture, the bond between mothers and daughters was sacred, seen as a reflection of the Virgin Mary's relationship to female humanity. By compelling women to endure profound suffering across generations, the French were not just breaking individuals, they were undermining the symbolic foundation that made family possible.
Historical records reveal that French captain Henri François Bertin, who eventually deserted and sought refuge in Portugal, provided a written account uncovered in British archives in 1957. In it, he mentioned having witnessed the procedure on 2 occasions.
Both times, the commanding officer who ordered it was a graduate of military academies in Paris. This was not the invention of an illiterate conscript.
This was designed by someone educated in classical history who understood Roman tactics of psychological warfare. That terrifies me more than the acts themselves.
Systematic, calculated, deliberately engineered by educated officers. That is what removes any remaining possibility of dismissing this as wartime chaos.
This was a science. Now you understand the full taxonomy. 7 methods, ordered by psychological severity, from social humiliation that ended in minutes, to witness trauma that lasted lifetimes.
From bounded horror that concluded when the soldiers moved on, to unbounded horror that survivors carried in their minds until they died.
And here is the historical question no one wants to ask. Why does this appear in almost no mainstream histories of the Napoleonic Wars? Why do French historians barely mention the Peninsular War at all?
Why did it take British historians until the 1980s to begin documenting these specific methods in academic journals? Because acknowledging this requires acknowledging that the army that claimed to fight for liberty, equality, and fraternity was capable of systematic cruelty that rivaled anything done by the backward empires they claimed to oppose.
It requires acknowledging that Enlightenment ideals and calculated atrocity can coexist in the same military organization, sometimes in the same individuals.
Here's the archaeological evidence that proves this was not Spanish propaganda. In 2003, during construction in Salamanca, workers uncovered a mass grave.
127 female bodies buried without ceremony in a single pit. Forensic analysis dated them to 1810 to 1812. Their skeletal injuries matched the testimonies.
Healed skull fractures, evidence of malnutrition. In several cases, pelvic damage consistent with trauma during pregnancy. The physical evidence confirms what the document said. This happened at scale, systematically. And here is the legacy that connects to your world today. The Spanish Constitution of 1812, drafted during the war, contained specific articles protecting civilian women during military occupation. It was the first constitution in European history to do so. Those articles exist as a direct response to what you just learned about.
When you read about war crimes tribunals today, about the Geneva Convention's protections for civilians, about the concept of crimes against humanity, you're reading the descendants of legal frameworks that emerged because of what French soldiers did to Spanish women from 1808 to 1814.
The witness chain method appears in military psychology textbooks today, not by name, but by mechanism, as an example of compound trauma engineering.
Therapists treating survivors of systematic violence use treatment protocols developed by analyzing exactly this type of multi-generational witness trauma.
The horror did not stay in the past. Its shadow extends into the present every time we define what is prohibited in warfare, every time we prosecute systematic violence, every time we try to articulate why some acts go beyond the inevitable cruelty of war into something that demands specific legal and moral categories.
You have now seen the full taxonomy, 7 methods, ranked by severity, each one worse than the last. The question is, which one do you think was truly the worst? The church protocol that destroyed spiritual refuge? The pregnancy protocol that targeted future generations? The starvation enclosure that turned dying into a prolonged exhibition? Or the witness chain that destroyed the boundaries between self and family?
Drop a comment with your assessment. This is not about morbid fascination. It is about understanding exactly what humans are capable of when the restraints of civilization collapse.
Because if we do not understand the full spectrum of what happened, we cannot recognize it when it starts to happen again.
If you made it through this entire taxonomy, you have demonstrated the intellectual courage to confront historical truth that most people would rather not acknowledge exists. That is not common.
If you want more comprehensive analyses of what history tried to erase, subscribe and hit the notification bell.
Because the taxonomies of horror do not end with Napoleon's soldiers. There are other domains, other hierarchies, other spectrums that need to be documented.
And if you think you are ready for the next descent, the next complete taxonomy of something history has been hiding, you will want to be here when it drops.
Until then, remember this. The 7 methods you just learned about existed within a military organization that considered itself the height of European civilization.
They occurred during a war fought in the name of Enlightenment ideals. They were committed by soldiers who returned home to be celebrated as heroes. That should disturb you more than the methods themselves, because it means the capacity for this level of systematic cruelty does not require monsters. It just requires the right circumstances, the wrong incentives, and the absence of accountability.
The taxonomy is complete. The gallery is closed, but the lessons remain open.